Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Canadian Ghost Stories, Volume 1, Story 1. Prior to 1882, the area now known as Rogers Pass, a steep avalanche-prone passage through the Selkirk Mountains some 40 miles east of Revelstoke, was largely unexplored. When in 1881 the Canadian Pacific Railway decided to run their track south through the Rocky Mountains, it became necessary to find a safe route through the treacherous terrain, and Major A.B. Rogers, an American railway location engineer, was chosen for the task. Rogers trekked through the unforgiving country the following year, plotting out a route that, while not risk-free, was the safest possible at the time. Construction on the line began in 1883. Opening in 1885, the newly christened Rogers Pass immediately became the most dangerous part of Canada's transcontinental railway. Between 1883 and 1911, the region's avalanches claimed over 250 lives. To put that into perspective, since 1782, Canada has recorded a total of 702 avalanche-related fatalities. The section of the pass between Cheops Mountain and Avalanche Mountain is the infamous site of Canada's single deadliest avalanche, the 1910 Rogers Pass disaster, when a frozen section of mountain swept down from Avalanche Peak and buried 58 men under 33 feet of snow and ice. It is also here that 7 men bore witness to the most spectacular, unexplained celestial phenomenon Revelstoke has known. In the moments leading up to the Rogers Pass fireball, there was no indication to the few present that the still winter night was different from any other. Temperatures hovered around freezing on the morning of December 18, 1997, as 3 two-man CPR crews, 2 aboard trains and 1 headed home to Revelstoke in a taxi, watched the night sky erupt. Some 15 years later, witnesses to the Rogers Pass fireball are reluctant to discuss details of the incident. I haven't talked about it since it happened, since one man who refused to say anything else on the record, and I don't want to start now. What details that have emerged tell of a booming sound followed by the appearance of an enormous yellow ball of light, crackling with what appeared to be electricity streaking across the canyon. Says one source, all of a sudden the sky went like daylight, bright daylight, and this big yellow ball slowly went over the valley. The fireball, which made no sound after its initial appearance, was then said to stop its progress and hover above the valley for 10 full seconds before finally disappearing behind Mount Sir Donald in the southeast. While, in the broad strokes, the Revelstoke fireball shares characteristics with Bolides, particularly large and bright meteors entering the Earth's atmosphere, those present feel as though something much different was taking place. I don't know what it was, said another witness, who claimed the light was so intense that other drivers on the highways began to swerve in shock. But I felt like it was looking at us. Though what follows is the only story of missing time to come out of the Revelstoke area, it is far from unique. Missing time episodes are a staple of paranormal lore, usually associated with the field of ufology, and cited by true believers as proof of extraterrestrial abduction. While that may seem fantastical, the circumstances surrounding episodes of missing time seem to defy all current understandings of time and space, making it understandable why the first explanation people reach for is literally out of this world. It begins with silence. While there have been reported instances of group missing time events, it is most common among those who are alone. The person, be they traveling or at home, experiences a momentary disorientation, then observes that a significant amount of time has passed, anywhere from minutes to hours to, in extreme cases, days. Several things differentiate this from simple sleep. The first being that aside from disorientation and a feeling of returning, as though from a general anesthetic, the person experiences no fatigue, dreams, or any other sign of sleep. Second, the episodes often occur while subjects are in motion, driving, walking, etc., without any loss of motor control. Thirdly, and perhaps most bizarrely, people who have experienced missing time also tend to wake up in different places than where their initial disorientation occurred. Some people even report waking to find they traveled a far greater distance than should have been possible given the time elapsed during their fugue. Those who have undergone episodes of lost in time are often reluctant to discuss their experience, and while they may not dream during the event, it is extremely common to dream after. Often these dreams are not pleasant. Henry. When he left his Golden, BC home for Revelstoke on the night of October 5th, 2002, Henry Talbot was no stranger to the winding 150-kilometer section of Highway 1 that connected the two towns via Rogers Pass. I had left about 9 p.m., driving alone, he recalls. Having driven the route many times, and usually at night, I expected to arrive in Revelstoke before 10:30 p.m. The danger inherent in traversing Rogers Pass didn't end with the coming of the railroad, even for those accustomed to the trip. Since the highway's completion in 1962, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of fatalities on its many curves and bends. One 8-kilometer section just outside of Golden is home to some 36 curves, including infamous School Bus Corner, where in 1990 a bus crash killed 2 young girls and wounded 28. As he set out that fall evening, Talbot knew that despite his familiarity, he would have to be careful on his journey west, and it's that heightened awareness which calls into question more mundane explanations of the following events. The first 20 to 30 minutes of Talbot's journey were unexceptional. The weather over the last few days had been mild, and there was almost no snow on the highway. It is from this point on events take a strange turn. There's a point on the eastern side of Rogers Pass where if you're heading west, the highway runs straight for a stretch, then takes a sweeping turn to the right, says Talbot. It then begins to climb towards the summit, passing through snow sheds, which are concrete tunnels built to deflect avalanches over tops of the highway on the way up. As he approached the turn, Talbot observed what appeared to be the taillights of a semi-truck disappearing around the curve. Next thing I know, says Talbot, I feel like I'm lost. The road seems unfamiliar, level and even a little downhill. Not the steep climb to Rogers Pass I was expecting to find around the corner. Disoriented, Talbot checked his dashboard clock. The car clock showed that it's a little before 11 p.m., and that makes me all the more confused. Then I pass a sign that says Revelstoke is only a few kilometers away. Talbot was unable to place his location, but was at a loss to explain how, given the attention he had been paying to the road, he had traveled more than 100 kilometers without realizing. I do not remember driving through any of the snow sheds on the way up or down, he says. How could I not remember even one of them? I don't remember driving through Rogers Pass Summit, where I'm normally very aware of roads and weather conditions, not to mention the bright lights and speed zones. Initially, Talbot blamed fatigue for the gaps in his memory, but the explanation was an uneasy one. I said to myself, who hasn't driven a familiar route and not remembered parts of it, he explains. But still I wondered how I could have forgotten so much, almost the entire trip, and how it was I ended up more than 30 minutes behind schedule. As he left his Revelstoke hotel, the next morning Talbot found his memory of the previous night's events as hazy as before, but the gaps bothered him less, at least consciously. I felt like something about my trip wasn't right, but it seemed very distant, he says. For some reason I also felt as though I would be happier not having to travel that route again. In the 11 years since that night, Talbot has done his best to abide by that mysterious feeling, taking that particular stretch of Highway 1 only once more in 2005. I traveled that road once more, with a passenger, at midday, and keeping other traffic in sight at all times, he remembers. I felt very uneasy on the stretch of road below Rogers Pass. Though over the years he may have physically returned to Rogers Pass only once, Talbot has found himself mentally returning again and again to that night in 2002. I often have had dreams about that trip, the parts of it that I remember, he says, as if I'm driving it over and over. One dream in particular has come to haunt him more than any other. In one dream, I watched the lights of the semi-truck ahead as it began to go around the corner. Suddenly, the lights reversed direction, and within a second or so, closed the distance and fly over my car. I'm leaning forward in the driver's seat, craning my neck to look upward through the windshield, where I see a single large red light a few feet above my car. I'm suddenly filled with terror and feel like I can't breathe. I begin hyperventilating and try to call out for help, but only make hoarse, squeaking sounds. Then I wake up. Though he's not convinced that this nightmare is any more than exactly that, and he has no concrete explanation for his fear, Henry Talbot still cannot bear the thought of driving Rogers Pass again. I do not want to be on that road, he says, and I don't really understand why. Next story. The following story relates about a property and a house that are long gone, bulldozed to make way for a new highway. Sitting on the west bank of the Columbia River, the part of Revelstoke known as Big Eddy, so named for the swirling currents of the rivers, is a strange mixture of residential, industrial, and agricultural land, bisected by the two-lane span of Highway 23. Until the coming of the highway built to reconnect Revelstoke with the Arrow Lakes region to the south, the Big Eddy was a bucolic patchwork of small farms, and it is from this time that Turk Wilson remembers seeing his first and only ghost. Now in his 70s, Will was a small boy when his family rented a farmhouse in the quiet rural community. The two-story clapboard home had a large front porch where the family would sleep on warm summer nights. It was next door to a large pasture where they kept a variety of livestock. Will's family lived in the house for several years before the property was sold and they were forced to relocate, eventually settling on another parcel of land nearby. After the move, Will would often walk past his former home on the way to school and remember seeing the same elderly man tending to the land. There was this old character, says Will. I don't know whether he bought it, or lived there, or was looking after it or something, but I remember he always had an old black hat on. A few years later, the old man died, and Will's family was again offered the opportunity to rent the property. Not long after moving back, Will remembered how one of their cows somehow kept managing to get from their fenced pasture into the family's yard where it would make a fantastic mess. We had this chain and a gate to keep her out, and that thing used to get in quite often, he says. The chain would be undone, and we were always at a loss. I guess it never occurred to anybody maybe to put a padlock on the damn thing. For several weeks it was the same. Every night the chain would go up. Every morning it would be on the ground, and the family stupid cow would be lazily chewing on Will's mom's flowers. Then one summer night, Will rose from where he'd been sleeping on the porch to see in the dusk a man unhooking the chain from the pasture fence. It was almost daybreak, maybe 3 a.m., and I woke up because my two dogs, big collies, were growling, he remembers. I turned to look at the gate, which was maybe half a block away, and could see someone standing there moving the chain. All I could see was the figure and the black hat. Well, you know, I wasn't too anxious to get out there. After a few moments, Will gathered his nerve and stepped off the porch, only to see the figure disappear in the gathering light. When he reached the pasture fence, the cow was nowhere to be seen and the chain was on the ground. Whatever the reason for the apparition, its appearance that morning was to be the last time it was seen by Will and his family, or anyone else. I never saw it again, says Will, and we never had any more trouble with the chain, for that matter. Next story. Wynne was born in London, England in 1922 and immigrated to Canada with her family at the age of 5. It was following the family's move from Vancouver to the town of Pioneer that Wynne met her future husband Ted, whom she wed in 1942. And it was there in Pioneer the two would eventually have their first children, Bruce and Jane. The family moved to Revelstoke in 1952, first settling into the rough wartime houses on East 5th Street and relocating to a 3-story home on Mackenzie Avenue 2 years later. The family added 2 more members, twins John and James. In 1916, it was several years afterward that Wynne took up painting. The third floor of the Mackenzie Avenue home became her studio. Several easels stood in the middle of the room. 3 of the 4 walls were hung with works both finished and unfinished, and the fourth was dominated by an enormous wooden desk her husband had to cut in half in order to fit it up the small stairwell. It was here Wynne would come to paint once the children had come to bed, and it was here, late at night, the boy, a spirit, would make the long journey from the land of the dead to watch. Wynne passed away in 2011, and though her son Bruce was never told about the boy, upon hearing the story said, "Mom did entertain some fancies." She used to tell me about him, a friend of Wynne's would say. He would come when it was all quiet and she was up there painting. A little fellow, around 10, 12 years old. He'd stand there watching her. He was with her for many years. Wynne came to expect and enjoy the visits from her longtime fan, even though she kept him a closely guarded secret from all but a handful of friends. The current residents of the Mackenzie Avenue home have never seen the child, or any other spirit for that matter, leaving us to wonder if it was drawn to the act of painting itself, or a combination of the two, and whether or not the pair has renewed their acquaintance in the life that follows this one. Next story. Almost anyone who has sat around a campfire has heard stories of ghostly hitchhikers. Though the specifics of such tales change from teller to teller, the broad outline is almost always the same. Late one night, a bored or altruistic driver sees a lone figure walking along a deserted strip of road and stops to offer them a ride. Before long, the driver begins to suspect there is something unusual about their new companion, and in due course is proven right. The stories have been part of popular culture so long, some people consider the 13th century story of St. Christopher, as told in the Golden Legend, the oldest such tale. They are often dismissed as fantasies, which fulfill our need for the unusual in day-to-day life. What is forgotten in this dismissal is the simple fact that legends often contain fragments of truth. The story of the girl on Highway 23 is one such fragment. It was a warm summer evening in the 1970s when Joan's foster children came running into the house looking for their mother. It had been a hot, hot day, and our kids were sleeping out on the porch, she remembers. They came in and said they could hear somebody crying for help. The farmhouse was located several kilometers south of Revelstoke on Highway 23, a remote wooded stretch of road that ends at the Shelter Bay Ferry Terminal on Upper Arrow Lake. At that time, the ferry service only ran into early evening, and by this point in the night, there was little reason for anyone to be on the road. The family hurried outside and immediately heard a child's voice calling from the darkness beyond the tree line in the direction of the highway. There was a young girl crying for help, said Joan. She was saying, "Help me, please, please, somebody help me." Ushering her children back inside, she phoned the police. They came up right away, and there was nobody on the road at all, remembers Joan. They went up and down the highway. They looked and looked, but there was nobody. Joan was almost ready to believe that she and the children had imagined the entire episode until the next morning, when she related the story to a neighbor, Hank, whose farm was several miles down the road from theirs. As it turned out, Hank had in fact seen someone on the road the previous night, a young girl, maybe 10 or 12 years old, pushing a bicycle with a large basket at the front, up the road towards Joan's farm. The girl was crying, and Hank assumed it was because she had broken the curfew and would be punished. "I thought she was one of your kids," he told Joan. Several years later, Joan's daughter was out riding her horse on a bright moonlit night when she came upon a young girl sitting in the ditch by the side of the road. The child was wrapped in a blanket and asked her for the time. Concerned for the child's safety, Joan's daughter came directly home and told her mother. "I said, a little girl shouldn't be sitting there alone," remembers Joan. "We went down there, but she was gone. I hollered, 'Come on, you can stay with us,' but nobody came." The pair waited there by the side of the road for some time before turning back. It was then, on the walk back to the farmhouse, a strange feeling came over Joan and her daughter. Her memory of meeting the little girl took on a sort of unreality. Joan recalled that her daughter said it was almost like it wasn't real, like she wasn't real, not a real person sitting there. This was to be the last time Joan's family had an encounter with the girl on Highway 23, but not the last time she was seen. Next story. The final reported sighting of the mysterious girl comes from the winter of 1980. Brothers Harold and Al were driving southbound in a blizzard on Highway 23, not far from the ferry landing, when they passed a young girl walking in the same direction. Though they no longer recall exactly what she was wearing, the brothers remembered it was not at all appropriate for the sub-zero conditions that day. Harold quickly reversed until they came upon the girl again, still trudging determinedly through the blizzard. The brothers offered the child a lift to the ferry, which she refused on the grounds she was headed for Revelstoke. They tried explaining that not only was she going in the wrong direction, but was almost 50 kilometers out of town, and given the howling wind, unlikely to make it very much further dressed the way she was. The girl simply kept walking. The brothers hurried to Shelter Bay Landing, where they alerted the BC Ferries personnel, who in turn alerted Revelstoke police. Just as before, police responded immediately, and just as before, no one was ever found. The girl on Highway 23 had disappeared again. Next story. The 230-kilometer section of Columbia River, known as the Arrow Lakes, stretches from Revelstoke Dam, just north of town, down to Castlegar in the south. Once two separate lakes, called Upper and Lower Arrow, Arrow Lake is now one continuous body of water, steeply bordered by the Monashee Mountains to the west and the Selkirk Mountains to the east. The two lakes joined when damming began on the Columbia River in the 1960s. The area is quiet, its roads, Highways 6, 23, and 31, not heavily trafficked, and a few towns that dot the region, Nagusup, Silverton, New Denver, Caslow, and Trout Lake, to name a few, are all sparsely populated, the largest of them boasting only 1,500 residents. Once upon a time, however, the Arrow Lakes region had a thriving mineral economy and many more towns, like Ferguson, Sandon, Cody, Circle City, and Girard, sprung up to house the influx of miners. Those towns have since faded into history, but their remains are seated among the area's lush woodland, and should one look hard enough, can still be found on unnamed backroads. Given all this, it is perhaps no surprise the Arrow Lakes region is a place of both beauty and mystery, from which more than a few strange stories have emerged. The trip south of Revelstoke on Airport Way is a lovely 14-kilometer drive that begins after the Ilikawit River Bridge, winds up through the wooded shrub of Arrow Heights, down the steep decline known as Red Devil Hill, and ends with a pavement where the Alcocolex Forest Service Road begins. It is a quiet, remote road that, before the Columbia River was dammed, led to the Arrow Lakes community of Arrowhead. The damming of the Columbia flooded some 2/3 of the Columbia River Valley's arable land, forcing communities such as Arrowhead, Beaton, and Burton to relocate, in some cases simply evacuate. Even in the area directly south of Revelstoke, past its modest airport, was once home to a number of thriving farms, which were abandoned when the reservoir began to fill. When the river is low enough, drivers on Airport Way can still make out the old highway beneath the water snaking past the stone foundations of sunken homesteads. It was here on Airport Way some 30 years ago that one family, out for an evening drive, went through an unexplainable feeling of collective terror that baffles them to this day. It was the summer of 1975 when the Scott family, parents Paul and Lily, daughter Paige, and granddaughter Emily, decided to take a break from their lengthy road trip and stop in Revelstoke for the night. We were slowly traveling across British Columbia and planning to circle through part of Alberta before heading home, Paige recalls. We arrived in Revelstoke late on a sunny summer afternoon, found a motel, and went for dinner. After dinner, the Scotts took a walk through Revelstoke's compact downtown, and afterward found themselves wanting to explore further. On their map, the family saw Airport Way in the Alcocolex FSR threading down the east side of the Columbia River. The purpose of the trip was to try to find roads we'd not yet traveled, says Paige, so off we went. The weather had been kind to the Scotts all day, but looking out over the river from the top of Red Devil Hill, they could see they were leaving clear skies behind and heading straight into cloud cover. In the distance, sheet lightning flashed. They had seen few cars on the road up to that point, but after Red Devil Hills, the Scots didn't see another soul until they turned back. Some 4 kilometers later, between the turnoffs of what are now Leonard Drive and Catherwood Road, a strange feeling came over Paige, who was sitting in the back seat with Emily. The road turned a sharp corner to the left and followed the base of the mountains around the large bay, she remembers. The moment we turned the corner, I was terrified. I wanted so much to ask my father to turn back. Paige couldn't explain the feeling that had come over her. The logical side of me kept saying not to be silly. She remembers the purpose of the trip was to explore. Nevertheless, she found herself so terrified she could no longer look out the windows of the car. She began to play with Emily, who seemed blissfully unaware of her mother's escalating fear. Suddenly, at a point roughly halfway around the bay, Paul pulled a hasty U-turn and sped back in the direction from which they'd come. He never spoke, but Paige heard her mother say quietly, "So you felt it too?" As soon as they had rounded that wide corner, the sun peeked through the clouds, and the family's collective feeling of terror vanished. As they drove back towards Revelstoke, the only words spoken were by Paul. "Promise me," he said, "that none of you will ever drive down that road again." On the way back to the hotel, the Scott family didn't speak a word to each other about what had happened, which Paige says was completely out of character. Not only would we normally have talked about something like that, she says, we would have driven back the next day to at least the beginning of the bay. In fact, it was 4 years before the family broached the subject again. None of them could recall a single reason why they had been afraid. Certainly they didn't remember seeing anything, but both Paul and Lily admitted to feeling the same sense of inexplicable, overwhelming terror that Paige had, the only member of the Scott family unaffected by the incident, whether because at 2 years old she was too young to understand or too small to see out the window, was Emily. In addition to an almost paralyzing fear, Paul recalled being filled with a baffling certain that if we had kept going, we would have never come back. Even more bizarrely, each of the family members found that they had wanted to discuss the event at some point in the preceding 4 years, but couldn't. I recall often trying to think about it and say something, but the thoughts and words just dissolved, recalls Paige. That was happening with my parents as well. We still have no understanding or memory about what frightened us. Some 20 years later, Paige returned to Revelstoke and the South Road with her husband. Everything had changed with the lowering of the lake level and the growth of the trees, she recalls. There was nothing at all frightening about the place. Even so, she honored the promise she'd made to her father and declined to go past the corner where it all had begun. The fear is gone, but 30 years later, Paige's memory still fragments when she tries to remember what happened to make her family feel what they did. I've stayed in Revelstoke many times since then, but will never travel that road, she says. Maybe someday I will remember why. Not far from the wide, sweeping curve on Airport Way where the Scots began to feel that inexplicable sense of dread, there sits a house where at least 2 families have had inexplicable experiences, all their own. The home, a relatively new one by Revelstoke standards, looks nothing like your stereotypical haunted house, and yet when the Pike family moved in 15 years ago, it wasn't long before they began to suspect something supernatural was happening around them. Next story. At first, Lisa thought she was dreaming. The sound of footsteps. I'd hear the sound of people going up and down the stairs all the time, she remembers. I'd wake up, get out of bed. I'd think it'd be our cat, but the cat was outside. The kids were sound asleep in bed. Sometimes this would go on all night long. Realizing she wasn't dreaming the footsteps, Lisa then pinned the noise on an overactive imagination. This didn't last long, as her 2 daughters, Tanya and Kelly, soon began to hear the footfall as well. The pair told their mother about hearing fast springing steps up the staircase. Curiously, Lisa's husband Stephen never heard the noises, nor did he experience any of what followed. My husband doesn't believe in this sort of thing, she explains. He thought we were being silly, that it was all explainable, but too many weird things happened to ignore. One such weird thing occurred during a sleepover birthday party for Tanya, the oldest daughter. This was when my daughter was 12 or 13 years old, Lisa remembers. In the morning, they said to me, "What was going on with the cat last night? It was running up and down the stairs and going crazy in here." Lisa was nonplussed. "The cat was outside," she says. "I just let him in this morning." As with many hauntings, it wasn't long before the presence in the family home manifested itself in a more direct way. Lisa remembers. "In our kitchen there's a 6-cupboard pantry. One morning I got up. The kids were still in bed. My husband had gone to work, and I came around the corner into the kitchen, and all the cupboard doors were open on the pantry. I thought my husband was playing a joke on me or something, right? Thinking I'd walk into these doors? Except when he got home, he swore to me he didn't do it." After the incident involving the pantry doors, Lisa began noticing that a set of Venetian blinds in one of the upstairs windows had taken on a mind of its own. "I opened my blinds one morning," she says. "Then later, we were outside, and I happened to look up at the windows, and the blinds were closed. I asked the kids who had closed them, and they all claimed they hadn't. I went in and opened the blinds, then went back outside. A couple of hours later, I looked, and the blinds were closed." That happened several times. Another unusual event occurred when Lisa's husband was away on business. The girls were quite little and would sleep downstairs with me. This one time, I woke up and the girls were still asleep, so I went upstairs to collect laundry and saw the sheets had been pulled back on one of the beds. No one had been upstairs, and yet somebody had been in my daughter's bed. Worried an intruder had somehow gained access to the house, Lisa checked all the doors and windows but found everything secure. Making the possibility of an intruder even more improbable was the fact that nothing else had been disturbed. "You know what," says Lisa, "some of this stuff can be explained away, I guess. Lots of people would dismiss it, but this wasn't explainable." The family experienced other strange things over the course of their time in the house around the bend. Some nights Tanya would wake up in her upstairs bedroom to see, in light cast by the family computer outside her door, their office chair spinning by itself. But only one phenomenon would be observed by anyone outside the family. This was the little girl in the blue dress. Lisa remembers a lazy summer afternoon when Kelly was 5 years old. Stephen was out of town on business, and the women were in the backyard enjoying the afternoon sun when Kelly casually mentioned playing with her new friend. Lisa, unaware of any new kids having moved into the neighborhood, asked Kelly where she had met her new friend and was not all prepared for her daughter's reply. "She lives with us." She swore by that for years, says Lisa. She still says yes, there was a little girl, and she wore a long blue dress and had long black hair. Nonetheless, the family was not disturbed by the phantom, and aside from Kelly's infrequent mentions of the spectral child, she was all but forgotten. That changed years later when the family, who had long since moved to a new home, received a phone call from a woman whose daughter had been babysitting for the latest residents of the house around the bend. According to the woman, her daughters had been looking after the couple's young children, a boy and a girl, and noticed the girl often referred to her sister. They said, No, you don't have a sister," says Lisa. She said, "Yes, I do. She comes and stays with me every night and leaves really early in the morning. Then she goes to the bushes." Lisa asked the caller if the child had described her sister. Says Lisa, the little girl described as having long dark hair and a long blue dress. Next story. Beneath the surface of the Upper Arrow, some 25 miles south of Revelstoke, lies the remains of Sidmouth, one of the many small communities flooded in 1968 when the much contested Hugh Canlyside Dam was built on the Columbia River, 5 miles upstream of Castlegar. Like residents of other flooded communities, the people of Sidmouth were given little say in the decision that saw their homes relocated and their town become part of the Arrow Lakes Reservoir. Almost 50 years later, the little bit of Sidmouth not covered by water is an overgrown tangle of fir, spruce, and alder trees accessible only by boat or helicopter. It is a quiet, contemplative place which gives no indication it was the site of Revelstoke's first reported instance of strange lights in the sky. Many more would follow, but that fall night in 1950 was the most widely observed and reported until the Revelstoke meteor impact of 1965. On the night of October 15th, 1950, an engineer in charge of the Pacific Asbestos Corporation mine site and some of his crew spotted an object in the night sky. According to a report in the October 19th, 1950 edition of the Revelstoke Review, under the headline Strange Object Seen in South Heavens, what the engineer and his men saw was a strange, oval-shaped object with a bluish-white light. Using binoculars, the engineer was able to get a better view of the object, which according to the article resembled a huge light globe swinging to and fro and was estimated to be up some 30,000 feet. The engineer and his men went on to say that the object remained in the sky above the Monashi Mountains for 30 minutes, from 9:30 to 10 p.m. before disappearing to the southeast. The incident was also reported in the October 1950 edition of the Vancouver Sun under the headline, Maybe Another Flying Saucer. Next story. It was the summer of 1977 when 3 crew members aboard a BC Ferries vessel saw a strange object flying low in the night sky above the Arrow Lakes. At the time, Larry was a ship's mate aboard the ferry, which ran passengers between Shelter Bay and Galena Bay on the Upper Arrow. Though Larry didn't see the object himself, he remembers the vessel had just made its final trip of the night and was heading for home when his shipmates burst in on him in the ship's office. It was a clear blue night, remembers Larry. There was Henry, John, Malcolm, and they come running into the office. They were astounded. The 3 men excitedly told Larry they had just seen a black object the size of a football field traverse the night sky some 100 feet above the ship. They said there were blue flames coming out the back, and it was silent, said Larry. The thing was going very slow, and then all of a sudden it left, and there was just a blue streak in the sky. It was gone. The ship's oilers sketched what they had seen. According to Larry, the drawing bore some resemblance to a dirigible, at least in shape. If the men's stories are to be believed, however, the object moved much faster than any airship, and Larry had no reason to question their credibility. Henry was the kind of guy who wouldn't admit to something unless it was true. It's just the way he was, said Larry. And John, he was a ship's engineer. He didn't believe in UFOs, but when he saw this, he believed. After the initial excitement wore off, the men found themselves unsure not only of what they'd seen, but whether or not they should tell anyone else. They were all a little mystified by it, says Larry. So consequently, they didn't really tell anyone else. People think you're seeing things, so you're afraid to say too much. What the 3 men thought of the object or whether they ever saw it again, we can only guess. Each died from natural causes within a 16-month span, some 6 years later. The 54-year-old Henry first passed away on April 18, 1992, Nelson, age 63, on April 2, 1983, and finally Malcolm, age 50, on August 18 of that same year. For his part, Larry, who lived for decades in the area south of Revelstoke before relocating to rural Arizona, had never heard of anything like it before and hasn't since. Next story. Tom is a tall, quiet man, around 60 years of age, who spent most of his life living in a small mobile home just outside Revelstoke city limits. On the subject of the supernatural, he is more or less agnostic. I've never seen a ghost floating across a room towards me, he says, so I have a real hard time believing people who say they have, but who knows? I sure can't explain what happened to me, so maybe there is something out there. The event Tom refers to happened in the early morning hours of November 4, 1973, by his own admission is not a story he shares often. My friends and I were cruising around town on a Saturday night. I had a 1960 Thunderbird, and a whole bunch of us were piled in there. It's Revelstoke, so there wasn't much going on. We decided to drive out to the old car dump at Silvertip Falls and see if we could cut mufflers off some old junkers, maybe make a couple bucks selling them. Silvertip Falls was a small waterfall located north of Revelstoke on Highway 23. The road was moved up the mountain in the early 1980s prior to the construction of the Revelstoke Dam, an event which most people believe flooded out the Silvertip Falls entirely, though Backroads map books claim a section of rapids near the site remains. But in 1973, the Big Bend Highway snaked along the Columbia River Valley, and at 2 a.m. on an overcast fall night was about as dark as a road can be. By the time we got out there, a fog had come down, and we were having a hell of a time picking out cars. So we decided to come back another time, said Tom. It was around 3 in the morning when we headed back south into town. The fog was so thick, Tom couldn't see much further than the hood of his T-Bird, but still he recalls driving the empty highway at a good clip. We were young and stupid and going too fast, he admits. I saw two eyes ahead of us in the fog. I slammed on my brakes, but it was too late. Tom remembers bracing for what he believed would be the body of a hitchhiker tumbling over the top of his car, but it never came. We were all freaking out, he remembers. I got out of the car and walked around, but couldn't find anyone. There was no dent in my hood or anything, but I knew I had seen those eyes. Nothing else, just two eyes in the fog. It was then that Tom made a discovery that forever cemented in his mind the night of November 4th, 1973. Whoever, or whatever, the eyes had belonged to, they had saved the lives of everyone present. Had the boys kept driving, Tom's Thunderbird would have sailed off the edge of the road and plummeted some 40 feet into the river below. It doesn't make any sense to me, says Tom. I have a hard time believing in that stuff, but I know what I saw. Next story. Roger was only 2 years old when his family first rented the Lundell house, moving from their apartments in the grand neoclassical Birch Lodge on Mackenzie Avenue. The 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom home with its gabled roof and screened-in side porch was a step up for the young family, and his mother, Violet, took a great deal of pride in its upkeep. The house was a pride and joy for my mother, and she put a lot of work into it, even though we didn't own it at first, said Roger. She felt that balanced out the things in the house that must accept us, and my mother always felt the house accepted us. It's a little hard to explain, he adds, but a lot of strange things happened over time, and as far back as I can remember growing up, it was haunted. Roger, who died in 2012 at the age of 50 by his own hand, remembered there being something unusual about a second-floor bedroom at the front of the house. While the room would eventually become his when he grew older, as small children he and his brother were forbidden from using the room for anything other than the storage of their toys. The room was above the living room, and often at night you would hear the high heels of a woman walking around, he said. I'm not sure of all the events because I was little, but my parents decided that nobody's staying in that room. To make ends meet, his mother would often rent out a small side bedroom to boarders. One boarder was a guy named Sid, remembers Roger. He was a funny guy, used to work for the newspaper. He would always have change in his pocket and always be rattling it around. Years later, after he passed away, you would still hear that, sometimes in the hallway. The family pets also seemed to be aware of the unusual occurrences in the home. We always had cats and dogs, said Roger. Often, in the living room, all the animals would turn and look through the French glass windows to the hall and watch something pass by up the stairs. That would happen a lot. One phenomenon that remained consistent throughout Roger's life was the house's tendency to disappear certain items, only to have them reappear hours, days, or even weeks later. He explained. Friends would come over, they'd bring a record saying we'd listen to it and then set it down to do some other things. And when it was time to go, there's no record. My friend would be freaking. How do you explain this to him? I'd say, don't worry, it'll show up. It'll just show up, and it would. Days later, there it would be. Years later, when Roger moved back into the home with his first wife, he found the spirits in the house had retained their mischievous nature. My former wife was doing Christmas cards one time, writing them all out, he said. She'd put the whole set down, go through the list, and then went to count them again. There were 3 or 4 missing. Days later they'd appear on a little side table. Though such events were commonplace, Morrison never felt the house was in any way malevolent. His mother, who would eventually purchase the home from its previous owners, felt the same. My mother always believed it was haunted, remembered Roger, but she still wanted the house badly. It meant a lot to her. She always felt the house was just playing games with us. Nothing bad ever happened. Next story. The apartment above Bocci's, a grocery store, was my first. I graduated in June of 2001 and paid the security deposit on my new home just after my 19th birthday in March of the following year. The place was enormous. Once upon a time it had served as 2 separate apartments, meaning it now had 2 full bathrooms and a total of 5 bedrooms. The amount of space was completely overwhelming, and I went about filling it with the toys you'd expect from an employed 19-year-old male. Big screen television, stereo, beer fridge, foosball table, and so on. Each room had a theme, if you can call it that. TV room, computer room, games room, except for one room at the very top of the stairs. The smallest room in the apartment, with a door in the closet that led to the attic. Nothing ever stuck there, and it became storage space and crash pad for passed out party guests. At first, the only door I made sure to close in the apartment was the outside door at the bottom of the stairs. The other door at the bottom led into the back room of Bocce's and was always bolted from the other side. After locking my front door, I'd leave every other one in the apartment, including my bedroom, wide open, and fall asleep with music playing on the stereo in the living room. Over the course of the next month, I found myself uncomfortable sleeping with the door open. There was no reason for it, but all the same I began closing the door before going to bed. Not long after, something started to bother me about music playing in the empty living room, and I started turning that off before closing the door. Finally, I reached the point where it was impossible to sleep unless the door was also locked. At this point, despite an abiding love of spooky stories and horror films, the idea of something supernatural taking place didn't even enter my mind. In fact, I thought I was going nuts. Then one night, as I lay in bed, my eyes closed, I heard what sounded like wine glasses clinking. That wasn't cause for alarm. The Canadian Pacific Railway's train yards is a stone's throw away, so I assumed the movement of a train was shaking the dishes in my cupboard. Then I began to hear other sounds, silverware on a table, light music, and finally, voices speaking indistinctly. It sounded like a grand dinner party taking place in my apartment. I bravely kept my eyes closed, rolled over, and stayed that way until I fell asleep. That was the beginning. In the following days and months, I began to hear something often reported by people who feel their homes are haunted. Footsteps in the night. In this case, they always came from the store downstairs. Now, it wasn't unusual for the owners of Bocce's to stick around after hours, sometimes to clean, sometimes to drink coffee, and shoot the breeze in the back room, so I was used to hearing their sounds, footsteps, voices, the ringing of the front door alarm when it opened and closed. Except, there were nights where I'd hear these sounds quite late, and when asked the next morning, the bosses would tell me everyone had left the store by 9 p.m. Then, on Halloween of 2002, I was approached at a house party by a woman who used to live in the apartment. "Hey, you live above Bocce's now, right?" she said. "Have you had anything strange happen up there?" When I asked her what she meant by strange, she went on to describe the same progression of emotions I had experienced after moving in, from comfort to unease to full-on paranoia. According to her, the roommates she had lived with didn't even like being in the apartment by themselves. She also said her children had invisible friends they'd play with, but only in the room at the top of the stairs. Eventually, I got a roommate myself, and despite not telling her a single thing about the strange feelings the apartment inspired, she too went through the same cycle and after a while didn't like being there alone either, particularly at night. By the time I moved away in 2004, things had quieted down so much in the apartment that I'd almost written off the things I'd experienced after moving in. Then one night, a few months later, I was in a coffee shop with friends when the young woman who rented the apartment after me came up and asked to speak privately. Once we were away from the table, she said, "You used to live above Bocce's, right? Did you ever have anything strange happen up there?" By now you can guess the rest of the conversation. A year later, the apartment was again vacant, and I was in the back room of the store counting up the day's receipts. The sound of heavy bass started coming from next door, which was odd since the neighbors had come by earlier in the week to let us know they'd be out of town. Assuming their kids were having a party in their absence, I went back to work only to stop again after remembering the kids had gone with them too. Rising from my desk, I realized the heavy bass sound wasn't coming from next door, it was coming from the empty apartment upstairs. Moving toward the door that connected Bocce's back room to the first floor landing of the apartment, I could hear the sound move as well. That strange, heavy thumping coming closer and closer. My first thought was maybe the boss had left the apartment door unlocked while he was showing tenants around and a local hobo had wandered in. Revelstoke is a small place, but even so, we have a few derelicts drifting around. After opening the door between store and the apartment, I could see the manager had remembered to lock the door behind him, meaning there was no way anyone could have entered afterward. Just then the thumping stopped, and there was footfall on the part of the stairs I couldn't see. I slammed the door shut, double-locked it, and bravely got out of there at top speed. That was in 2005. It would be my last interaction with whatever is going on at Bocce's for almost 6 years. The store was sold to new owners in early 2006, and I ended up relocating to the southern tip of Vancouver Island just over a year later. It was during a visit home in January of 2011 that I had what was my last strange encounter with the building. While out for a walk one night, I found myself standing across 4th Street from what had been our store. The new owners hadn't lasted long, and now the lower part of the building was under construction to be turned into a spa and yoga studio. It was cold that night, but I stood there for almost an hour thinking about the 6 years we had spent running Bocce's and everything that had meant to us. A burst of light, like a camera flash, in one of the darkened upstairs windows startled me from my reverie. It was a bright blue light and appeared to come from what was once my living room. For a moment, I stood there wondering why someone would take pictures in the dark, and was just about to conclude the whole thing had been my imagination when the flash repeated itself, in every window of the apartment simultaneously. I very quickly turned and made my way home.